Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited. John Haynes, the man with nothing to lose. The man who rules the world runs into the irresistible force of a man with nothing to lose in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get the regular and variant editions of John Haynes, the man with nothing to lose on Amazon.com today. One of my viewers wanted to know, how can an aspiring writer find the motivation to finish their first draft? And the answer to that is very simple. You have to believe in what you're writing. Because if you don't believe in what you're writing, you're not going to finish that story that you started. Now, many young writers out there who are working on their first projects, they come into their projects with a lot of enthusiasm, but they don't understand how much work is going to be involved in a writing project. And emotion will get you started on a writing project, and you'll be writing feverishly the first couple of chapters, and you may even get through the first act based on just your enthusiasm and your emotion. But what happens to a lot of first-time writers is they wind up slowing down on the second act, and that slowdown, what happens is, leads to them losing their motivation to finish the story. Now, a lot of these first-time writers don't understand why they are slowing down, but the reason why you're slowing down isn't really because you've lost any motivation. It's because your brain can't keep up with your hands. And the big problem with a lot of first-time writers is that they don't understand is, while your brain can imagine all of this stuff, your two hands can only put so many words on a page when they are on a keyboard. So when a writer is out here and they are trying to type all of this stuff they're imagining, it can wind up leading to them feeling frustrated and feeling overwhelmed, because you're trying to write all of this stuff you're imagining, and it's just your body just isn't able to do it. And because your body winds up getting fatigued, this is what leads to a lot of writers getting discouraged. And because they get discouraged, what happens is they start losing their motivations to finish their first drafts. Now, I've seen with a lot of first-time writers, what happens is they will come into the first act of the story, the first couple of chapters, with all of this enthusiasm, with all of this passion, and then what happens is around the second act they start getting tired, and what happens is they start to, because the second act requires a lot more thought process and a lot more critical thinking about character actions, character motivations, and story points, they start to lose their motivation to finish that part of the story. And what happens is they stop believing in what they're writing. And because they stop believing in what they're writing, the second act starts to fall apart. It starts to become uninspired, and the story starts losing its energy because the writer is struggling with finding their own energy. And that's the big problem with a lot of first-time writers, is they don't understand how to keep their momentum going and their motivation going, because they are trying to rush a story out instead of trying to understand that writing is a marathon and not a sprint. And that's the other big problem with first-time writers, is a lot of them want to sprint and get to the end of the story very quickly. But when you're doing projects, especially larger projects like novels or screenplays or a nonfiction book, you have to use a marathon approach. And in a marathon approach, you're going to pace yourself very slowly, and you're going to pace yourself so that you can make sure that you're going to present all of your points that you want to make in the story, make them clearly and make them succinctly so that the reader can understand them, because that's the thing that you want to do. Now, in order to stay motivated, again, the primary thing you need to do is believe in your story. The whole reason why you are sitting at that desk every day putting your fingers to the keyboard is because you believe in your story. And because you believe in your story, you want to go out here every day and write a little bit of it every day. Now, when I go out here and I write novels like a Spellbound or a Legendary Mad Matilda or a Temptation of John Haynes, I oftentimes, when I look at those projects, when I get motivated to write them, I don't try to take on the entire project in just a couple of weeks or a couple of months. I usually come in with a plan that I've outlined maybe even 6 months to a year before, and I don't try to rush the story through. I know what I want to write because I've already set up my theme in my outline. I've already set up the message I want to say in my story, and I believe in the message that I wanted to present in that story. So because I believe in that story and I believe in the message I have outlined, that's what motivates me to go back to the keyboard every day to put fingers to that keyboard and continue to push through and finish that story. Now, one of the big mistakes a lot of first-time writers like to do is they want to rush through a story, and you don't rush through a story. If you're not feeling inspired to write that day, just don't write that story. I mean, yes, you should write every day, but the whole thing is you don't have to write that story every day. Sometimes it's good to take a minute away from the keyboard to write something else or focus on something else, because that will help you find that spark of motivation to come back at that story in an inspired fashion. Because one of the other mistakes a lot of writers, first-time writers, make is thinking they have to sit there in front of that keyboard all day and keep working on that same story. But I'll tell you from experience, that's the fastest way to make yourself crazy, is to sit there in front of that keyboard and try to write parts of that story when you're not feeling those parts of the story, especially when you're writing things like the second act. Now, a lot of first-time writers, they run into big problems with that second act of the story, because that's when their bodies start to get tired. Because usually, again, when you have your writers, they will have a lot of enthusiasm and passion for those first couple of chapters, but when it gets to that second act, that's when the fatigue starts to set in, and that's when they start trying to force things as related to plot points, force things as related to character development, force things as related to character motivation, force things, and the story stops flowing organically, and we don't really connect with the story in the way we did in the first act, and things fall apart because the writer is trying to force things to go on because they want to push through to finish the story. And that's not how you finish a story, because you're clearly not motivated in the right way. What happens when you're out here and you're trying to force things is you're just doing things by the number, by just going through the motions, and you're not coming at it with the same passion you had. And again, the way you overcome that is to believe in your story, and if you really believe in your story, you want to give readers the best story that you can possibly give them. And sometimes the best way you give them the best story is to take a minute, step away from the computer, and step back and take a minute to breathe. Sometimes you just have to go out and take a walk sometimes, or go out here and go someplace else and step away from that story for a moment in order to get that inspiration again. And this is one of the things that the first-time writers oftentimes think about, is that they have to be in front of the keyboard all the time. They have to always be there, and that's why those second acts are always slow and having issues, because they don't take that minute to say, hey, let me just leave this alone for a minute, and then I'll come back to it. Now, some writers, what they think is if they leave the keyboard alone for a minute, they'll never come back, but that's not the case at all. A lot of times you have to take that minute away in order to rediscover that motivation for what's going to drive you to finish that story. Because the whole thing is, when you're in a same environment all the time and you're always in the same place all the time, it can just really mess with your mind and prevent you from being able to feel that excitement for that story. So you really want to take a break from that story and go out here and go do some other things in life. And really, you don't really need to be in front of the keyboard all the time. I mean, all you have to do is every day just do an hour or so writing something. It doesn't have to be that story, but eventually, if you feel like there's something you want to write in the story, you write a part of that chapter or a chapter here or there. But the whole thing is, again, to understand that this is a marathon, not a sprint, and you're going to take your time to write this story. You're going to just go and write the parts when you feel inspired to write. And you're not on anybody's deadline. That's another thing that a lot of first-time writers need to understand is you are not on a deadline. So you're not working with a professional editor. You're not working with a professional publisher. You're just writing something that you believe in, something that means something to you. And when it gets done is when you want it to get done. You are not under any sort of pressure to get this book done to anybody's standards but your own. So you don't have to sit there and think that you have to go out here and write something perfect, because the first draft of a first-time writer's book is not going to be perfect. It isn't going to be the greatest, but the whole point is to get through that first draft. And again, the way you find that motivation to get through that first draft is to believe in your story. And the thing that's going to make you commit to work every day on that story or every other day on that story is your belief in what you're writing, your belief that your story matters, and that your story is something special and something you want to share with others. So it's your story, and it's about you being the one who wants to get it out there. So the only person who can get that story out there is you. So the only person who is keeping you from writing your story is you. And the whole thing is, you have to understand that you can get in your way if you don't understand certain things as related to writing, that this is a marathon, not a sprint, and your brain can only process so much information before it gets overwhelmed. Because this is another part of what happens to a lot of writers when they're writing their second act, is they wind up getting so overwhelmed with the ideas that they want to put on the page that they wind up getting frustrated and overwhelmed. And because they wind up getting frustrated and overwhelmed by the sheer number of ideas that they want to put on the page and the sheer number of thoughts they want to put on the page, that they wind up slowing down. And this slowdown is the thing that leads to them not understanding that it's a brain-body issue. And the whole thing is, when your brain is running so many thoughts, your hands can only process so much information. And that's what's leading to you winding up slowing down. But the way you find your motivation to get through that is to slow yourself down, because you're going too fast and you're trying to rush too much information to your fingers, and your fingers can only type out so much information. I mean, even your computer can only process so much information before it completely crashes. So you have to understand that your brain and your body can only do but so much. And again, you have to take your time and just go slow at it, because this again is a marathon, not a sprint. And while your brain wants to rush to the finish line, sometimes you have to listen to your body, because if you don't listen to your body, what you're going to do is make yourself very sick. And that's something I've had to deal with when I'm working on many projects, is understanding that while my brain wants to go in one speed, my body can only go at another speed. And if I keep trying to push myself too far, what I'm going to do is wind up either with a mental issue, or I'm going to wind up with a physical issue where I wind up injuring myself trying to go too fast. So again, your motivation is you believe in your story, but you have to temper that belief in your story with discipline, and it takes time to get to that story, to get that story to the finish line. But you have to understand that, again, this is not going to be something that you're going to do in a couple of weeks or even a month or so. This is something that may take 6 months, 8 months, a year, 2 years, depending on what your schedule is, depending on what you're doing. I mean, if you have a full-time job, you don't, and you have other things to do, those things are going to take priority. But you can maybe work in an hour or two on a project if you believe in that project, and you'll find if you believe in your project, you'll find that the time will make itself for you, and you'll be able to get the project finally done. But again, your motivation is coming from your belief in your story, you believing in the message you want to share with people, believing in the story you want to tell, because that's the thing that's going to drive you to go out here and put on that computer, put your fingers to the keyboard, and work on that story from scene to scene and build that story all the way from beginning to conclusion. I'm hoping that this advice motivates writers to go out here and understand that the only thing that is going to allow them to finish their first draft is them, and that if you don't believe in your story, then you're not going to finish your story, because the only person who can finish your story is you, and you have to have that motivation to get up every day and work on that story, or to go out here and put the thoughts towards making that story the best it can be. It's all about you, and it's all about what you want to put on that page. So you have to understand that it's your story, and the only way you can get to share that story with readers is by having that drive to finish that story and have that drive to make that story the best it can be. I'm hoping that this advice gives you the motivation to go out here and finish that first draft, because I know that if you really believe in your story, you can put together a really great story. Now, if you want to see me make another video like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, and the Smith-Storella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.